Thorn-crowned the Omega, they discarded Prologue, the line I read 1,000 times. I died reading the last page of a novel called Thorn-crowned. Not dramatically. Not tragically. I died the most boring death imaginable. A truck, a crosswalk, a phone screen still open to chapter 214, the chapter where Setsu Ren Ashgrove, the discarded Omega fiancé of the Empire's future tyrant, is thrown out of the palace in the rain with nothing but the clothes on his back and a broken engagement ring shoved into his hand like an insult. I remember thinking, even as the world went white, that poor kid never got a real ending. He just disappears from the story after chapter 20. Nobody ever explains what happens to him. I should have been more careful what I wished for. Because when I opened my eyes again, I was soaked to the bone, kneeling in mud outside a palace gate that glittered gold even through the storm, and a voice above me, cold, beautiful, and utterly without mercy, was saying the exact words I had read 1,000 times. The engagement between House Vale and House Ashgrove is dissolved. Take the discarded Omega away. I looked up into the face of Crown Prince Cassian Vale, the villain of the book I just died reading, and I understood, with a clarity that felt like drowning, that I was no longer reading Setsu Ren Ashgrove's story. I was Setsu Ren Ashgrove. And I remembered exactly how this story ended for people like me. Face down in an unmarked grave by winter. Not this time. Chapter 1: The Discarded Omega. The rain didn't stop for 3 days, and neither did the whispers. Ashgrove's Omega cast off before the ink on the betrothal contract even dried. Did you hear why? They say his family forged the trade ledgers. They say worse. I sat in the ruin of what used to be my family's townhouse, half its furniture already seized by the crown's debt collectors, and I let the whispers wash over me like they belonged to someone else. In a way, they did. Setsu Ren Ashgrove, the boy whose body I now wore, had spent 18 years being soft, obedient, and quietly in love with a prince who saw him as furniture. That boy would have curled up and cried until the cold took him. I was not that boy. Not anymore. I knew things. I knew that in exactly 6 months, House Vale would use a forged treason confession to have my parents executed publicly, in the same square where my engagement had just been shattered. I knew that Cassian Vale would ascend the throne 2 years early on the ashes of that lie, and that his reign would salt 3 kingdoms with war before the final page of a book nobody but me would ever finish. I knew, because I had read it. Twice. The second time specifically to see if the author ever gave the discarded fiancé a happy ending. She hadn't. So I would have to write my own. You're not eating. My mother's voice cracked through the doorway. Lady Ashgrove had not slept in 3 nights. The elegant Omega who'd raised me raised him. I corrected myself. Though the line between us was blurring more every hour, looked like a woman watching her whole world collapse in slow motion. Because it was. I need to talk to father, I said instead of answering. Tonight. Before the tribunal summons come. Ren. They're going to accuse him of treason. The words fell out of me flat and certain, the way you'd read a weather report. A forged ledger. Grain shipments that never happened, signed with his seal. It's already been drawn up. I don't know when it gets filed, but I know it exists. My mother went very still. How could you possibly know that? I didn't have an answer that wouldn't get me labeled a madman or a witch, so I said the only thing I had, because I intend to stop it. But I need you both to trust me without asking me to explain how I know. She didn't trust me. Not that night. But she also didn't stop me from spending my last coin bribing a clerk in the Ministry of Records for a look at the incoming case files, and when I found the forged ledger exactly where memory told me it would be, filed under a false date and waiting to be discovered, something in her expression finally cracked open into something like belief. Who taught you to do this? She whispered, staring at evidence of a plot that hadn't been sprung yet. A novel, I thought. A very long, very cruel novel that I apparently agreed to live inside of. Nobody, I said. I just pay attention. We burned the false ledger that night. It bought us time, not safety, never safety. House Vale had 100 other knives to use, but time. Enough time for me to do the one thing that boy in the book never got the chance to do. Find allies who hated House Vale as much as I now did. I already knew exactly where to look. The book had given me a map of grudges I hadn't cared about the first time I read it, because they belonged to side characters. Minor princes. Forgettable names in forgettable footnotes. They weren't forgettable anymore. They were the only chance I had. Chapter 2: Ashes of a House. The tribunal summons came anyway, 3 weeks later than the book had promised, because I'd already bled Vale's timeline off course simply by existing, but it came. I watched from a servant's gallery, disguised in a beta's borrowed coat, as my father was dragged before a council that had already decided his fate before he opened his mouth. I watched my mother collapse when the verdict was read. I watched the executioner's blade catch torchlight the way it does in every story that wants you to remember the color red for the rest of your life. I did not save them. I want to be honest about that, because every hero in every story I've ever loved gets to save someone in their first act, and I didn't. I was 17 days too slow, 1 bribe short, 1 ally short, and I have carried that particular grief like a stone in my chest ever since. Rewriting a story does not mean you get to undo every page. It means you get to decide what the next one says. What the next page said was this: House Ashgrove was stripped of title, land, and name. I was given 12 hours to leave the capital before I, too, could be legally disposed of as an unclaimed Omega of a disgraced house, a phrase so clinical it took my breath away when the magistrate read it aloud, like grief could be filed in triplicate. I left with nothing. A traveling cloak. A dagger I didn't know how to use yet. And a memory of a story that told me, very precisely, where 3 angry, powerful, thoroughly wronged men were currently licking their own wounds, each one with a reason to want House Vale burned to the foundation. I found the first of them in a border tavern that smelled like wood smoke and old blood, 3 days' ride from the capital, exactly where the book had put him in a single throwaway paragraph I'd never expected to matter. He was enormous. Silver-eyed. Built like the wolves his clan was named for, with a scar over one eyebrow that the book had mentioned once and never explained. He had a bounty on his head from House Vale for a rebellion that had gotten his father killed and his people scattered, and when I sat down across from him uninvited, he looked at me the way you'd look at something that had wandered very stupidly into a wolf's den. "You smell like Vale's perfume," Caliph of the Northern Clan said, low and dangerous. "Which means you're either their spy, or you're the Omega I heard they threw into the mud outside the palace gates last month." "The second one," I said, and made myself hold his gaze even though every instinct in this new Omega body screamed at me to look away from an alpha built like a small avalanche. "I have information about House Vale that took your father's death and turned it into a legal formality. I know the names of the men who signed off on it. I know where the orders originated. And I know Cashin Vale is going to be crowned 2 years before he's supposed to be, using a lie almost identical to the one that got your people slaughtered." Caliph went very quiet. "And what," he said finally, "do you want in exchange for that information?" I had rehearsed this answer for 3 days on the road, and it still came out shaking. "An alliance," I said. "Not charity. Not pity. I have knowledge you don't. You have an army I don't. House Vale destroyed both our houses and called it justice. I intend to make them pay for that in a currency they actually understand." For a long moment, the Wolf Prince only studied me and I watched something shift behind those silver eyes, something between suspicion and the terrible, cautious hope of a man who has been waiting a long time for someone to say, "I want the same thing you want." "You're either the bravest Omega I've ever met," he said slowly, "or the most foolish." "Ask me again in a year," I said. "I'll have an answer for you." He didn't smile. Wolves like him rarely did. But he pushed a second mug of ale across the table toward me, and in the language of men who'd both lost everything to the same enemy, that was as good as a handshake. I had my first ally. I would need at least 2 more before winter, because the book had made one thing very clear: House Vale did not lose. Not to one broken house. Not to one grieving prince. It would take an army of grudges to burn a crown down. Chapter 3: The Shadow Prince. The second name on my mental list belonged to a man the book had barely bothered to give a face. Rowan Duskmere, illegitimate prince of the Aurelian court, exiled for the crime of existing. That was the entire sentence. The novel spared him a footnote, a rumor, a name mentioned once in a scene about court gossip and never again. But I remembered the rumor beneath the rumor. The detail the story never spelled out because it wasn't relevant to Cashin Vale's arc. Rowan's mother had been an Omega noble at the Vale court, seduced and discarded by the previous Vale patriarch the same way I had just been discarded by his son. She'd died in exile with a child no court would acknowledge. I found Rowan exactly where old grudges tend to collect, in the shadows of a city that had no love for the crown, running a smuggling operation so quiet even House Vale's spies hadn't fully mapped it. He found me first, which told me everything I needed to know about how dangerous he actually was. "You're the Ashgrove Omega," he said, materializing out of an alley like the Dark had personally decided to let him through. Where Caliph was all raw, visible power, Rowan was the opposite: slender, sharp-featured, dressed like a merchant's clerk, with eyes the unnerving gray of a storm that hasn't decided yet whether to break. "Word travels. You've been very busy making yourself a target." "Word travels faster than I expected," I admitted. "Which means I should introduce myself properly before you decide I'm a liability instead of an asset." "I already know who you are." Something flickered behind his careful, unreadable expression. Recognition, maybe, or the particular ache of meeting your own reflection in a stranger's ruin. "House Vale ruined your family over a lie. Convenient, don't you think, that they've done exactly that before?" "Your mother," I said quietly, and watched him go very, very still. "I know what they did to her. I know they used her the same way they used me, as a decoration to be discarded once the political math changed. I'm not here to relitigate your grief, Rowan. I'm here because you have resources, patience, and a decade of quiet hatred for the same house I intend to dismantle. That's not a coincidence I'm willing to waste." For a long moment, the Shadow Prince said nothing at all, and I genuinely didn't know whether he was going to help me or have me disappeared before dawn. Then, slowly, the ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You're either remarkably well informed," he murmured, "or something else entirely. I haven't decided which yet." He stepped closer, studying me with the unsettling focus of a man cataloging every possible use for a new tool. "But I find I'm curious enough to let you finish your pitch, little Omega. Convince me House Vale actually burns this time, and not just in another pretty story that ends with people like us in unmarked graves. I told him everything I dared. The forged ledger, the Coronation timeline, Kalitha's alliance, and, carefully, the shape of a plan that had been forming in my mind since the moment I understood I wasn't just surviving a story anymore, I was rewriting one. By the time I finished, dawn was bleeding gray over the rooftops, and Rowan Duskmere had gone from a shadow in an alley to something dangerously close to an ally. "Careful," he said as I turned to leave, voice soft enough that I almost missed it. "Men like Kalith and I don't forgive easily, and we don't forget at all. If you're building an army out of our grudges, Renash Grove, you'd better be prepared for what happens when we finally get to use them." I looked back at him, storm-gray eyes, a decade of buried fury wrapped in a merchant's calm, and felt, for the first time since I'd woken up in the mud outside a palace gate, something that wasn't quite fear. "I'm counting on it," I said. Chapter 4: The Archmage's Bargain. The third grudge I needed was harder to reach, because it belonged to a man the story had buried under a title so grand it obscured the wound underneath. Selwyn Emberlin, last surviving heir of a bloodline house, Vale had spent 2 generations quietly, patiently erasing. I found him in a tower that officially didn't exist on any map, 3 weeks, and 2 bribed guides after Rowan finally agreed to point me in the right direction. Payment, he'd said with something like amusement, for the privilege of watching me try. Selwyn was nothing like I'd pictured. The book described him once, briefly, as the reclusive court mage nobody remembers inviting. In person, he was younger than that description implied, silver hair pulled back with mechanical precision, ink stains on both hands, and an expression that suggested he'd catalogued my arrival, my clothing, my exhaustion, and probably my blood type before I'd finished climbing his stairs. "House Vale's discarded Omega," he said, without looking up from the manuscript he was annotating. "I wondered when you'd find your way here. You've been remarkably efficient, recruiting a wolf and a shadow in under 2 months. Should I be flattered or alarmed that I'm apparently next on your list?" "Both, probably," I said honestly, and something in his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough to count as one. "My family's bloodline artifacts," Selwyn said, setting his pen down at last, "were the last true convergence relics in the Empire. Do you know what a convergence relic does, little Omega?" I remembered the passage from the book, an academic footnote I'd schemed at the time and would now give almost anything to have read more carefully. "It binds bonds," I said slowly, memory sharpening as I spoke. "True bonds. More than one, sometimes the old Omegaverse magic, before the Crown decided single bonding was more politically convenient to enforce." Selwyn's pale eyes sharpened with something between surprise and suspicion. "Very few people outside my bloodline know that anymore. House Vale made sure of it, burned the archives, murdered my siblings, and confiscated the last 3 relics under the polite fiction of preserving imperial heritage. They didn't want the old magic remembered. A convergence bond is a threat to a throne built on controlling exactly who Omegas are permitted to love, and how many. Then you understand," I said carefully, "why I need you specifically. Not just your grudge. Your knowledge." "Do I?" Selwyn rose, circling me slowly, the way he might examine a spell that had gone slightly, interestingly wrong. "You're not simply gathering allies with matching grudges, are you, Renash Grove? You're building something the Crown outlawed 100 years ago because it terrified them. A bond that doesn't answer to Vale law. A bond powerful enough to make an Omega untouchable, instead of disposable." I hadn't let myself say it out loud yet, not even to Kalith or Rowan, the shape of the plan that had been assembling itself in the back of my mind since the moment I understood exactly what kind of story I was living inside. But Selwyn had said it plainly, and I found I couldn't deny it. "I want a bond House Vale can't legislate away," I said. "I want to be the kind of Omega their laws were specifically written to prevent from ever existing again, and I think you're the only person left alive who remembers how." For a long, charged moment, the last Emberlin heir studied me with an intensity that made the small room feel entirely too warm. "You understand," he said softly, "that a true convergence bond isn't a political maneuver. It doesn't work if it's calculated. It requires," he paused, choosing the word with visible care, "devotion. Real devotion, from every party involved, or the magic simply refuses to take. You cannot fake your way into this, little Omega. Not with me. Not with the wolf. Not with the Shadow Prince, who I assume you've also charmed by now." Heat crawled up my neck that had nothing to do with the tower's warmth. "I'm not trying to fake anything." "No," Selwyn said, and this time the almost smile finished forming into a real one, sharp, unexpectedly warm, utterly unlike the cold Archmage rumor had painted him as. "I don't believe you are. That's rather the problem, isn't it?" I left the tower 3 days later with an ally, a growing unease about exactly what I'd agreed to build, and a warmth low in my chest that I refused, for now, to examine too closely. I had 3 princes. 3 grudges. 3 men who hated House Vale enough to burn the world down beside me. What I hadn't planned for, what the book had never once warned me about, because the book had never imagined me surviving this far, was how much more complicated it would become the moment all 3 of them stopped looking at me like a useful weapon, and started looking at me like something worth protecting for its own sake. Chapter 5: What the Old Magic Remembers. Winter found us in Selwyn's tower, the four of us circling a plan that had grown teeth since autumn. Kalitha's clans were massing quietly along the northern border, waiting for a signal. Rowan's network had infiltrated 3 separate branches of House Vale's finances, patient as rot working through old wood. Selwyn had spent 2 months reconstructing fragments of convergence magic from memory and salvaged notes, and I had spent those same 2 months learning, slowly, painfully, what it actually meant to let 3 furious, guarded men close enough to trust. It should not have surprised me that trust, given enough time in close quarters, curdled into something else. It started small. Kalitha's hand lingering half a second too long when he steadied me on an icy staircase. Rowan appearing at my door at absurd hours with tea I hadn't asked for and conversation I found myself craving more than I wanted to admit. Selwyn's careful, precise voice softening whenever he explained something to me that he clearly assumed I'd find dull, and never once actually finding dull, because he made even old magic sound like a love letter to the world. "You're doing it again," Rowan told me one evening, catching me watching Selwyn diagram bond lattices across a chalkboard with the kind of focus most men reserved for something far less academic. That face. What face? The one that says you didn't expect to survive this story, let alone want anything from it besides revenge. His gray eyes were unfairly gentle for a man who ran half the capital's black market. "It's not a crime, Ren, wanting more than the ending you were promised." I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't think I do, not fully because the boy whose body I wore had been promised nothing but disposal, and the person I'd become in his place had planned, very carefully, to want nothing that could be taken from me again. It was Kalith who broke through that particular wall first, on a night the mark began to bloom. We'd been arguing pointlessly, the way people argue when the real conversation is too large to have directly about whether to move against House Vale's grain monopoly before or after spring thaw, and I'd gotten close enough in my frustration to jab a finger into his ridiculous, immovable chest, and something in the room changed. Heat, sudden and startling, bloomed under my skin where our bodies nearly touched. Kalith went absolutely still, silver eyes wide with something I'd never seen on him before, not battle focus, not fury, something far more unguarded. "Ren." His voice had dropped an octave. "Your hand." I looked down. A faint, silvery mark had begun tracing itself across the back of my wrist, delicate as frost on glass, pulsing faintly in time with my heartbeat. Selwyn was across the room in an instant, seizing my wrist with the reverent urgency of a scholar witnessing a myth confirm itself. He looked up at me, at Kalith, and then, as Rowan crossed the room too fast to be casual, at all 3 of us together. "That's a convergence thread. The first stage. It only manifests when the bond is real, Ren. Not calculated. Not forced. It's already begun." "Begun how?" I managed, though some traitorous part of me already knew. "It means," Selwyn said quietly, "that some part of you already trusts us. All 3 of us. Enough for the old magic to notice." I should have been afraid. I had spent months building this alliance as a weapon, a means to an end, a way to burn down the house that destroyed mine, and somewhere in the middle of forged ledgers and border wars and stolen relics, it had become something I hadn't planned for at all. Rowan reached out first, fingers ghosting over the mark on my wrist with a gentleness that didn't match the Shadow Prince's reputation at all. "For what it's worth," he murmured, "I don't think any of us planned this either." Kalitha's hand came to rest, warm and enormous, over both of ours. "The clans have a saying," he said, low. "A wolf doesn't choose its pack by accident. Something in you chose us, little Omega, same as something in us chose to keep answering when you knocked." I looked between the 3 of them, the wolf, the shadow, and, when I turned, the Archmage watching us all with an expression too raw to be scholarly interest alone, and understood, with a clarity sharper than any memory the book had given me, that I had built something the story I'd read had never once imagined possible. I did not know yet what it would cost us. I only knew that for the first time since I'd woken up in the mud outside a palace gate, I did not feel discarded at all. Chapter 6: House Vale Strikes Back. House Vale noticed us in early spring, and they noticed all at once. I should have expected it should have known that 4 grudges converging in one tower, 1 wolf clan massing at the border, 1 smuggling network unraveling Vale's finances thread by thread, could not stay invisible forever. But knowledge of a story is not the same as control over it, and I had learned, painfully, that the moment I started changing the plot, the book stopped being a map I could trust completely. The first blow landed at dawn, when Vale's soldiers burned 3 of Rowan's safehouses in a single coordinated strike, killing 11 of his people and very nearly Rowan himself, who arrived at the tower 2 days later with a wound across his ribs. He refused, with maddening stubbornness, to let Selwyn heal properly until the rest of us had heard his report. "They know about the convergence bond," Rowan said through gritted teeth, while Selwyn's hands glowed faint gold over the wound and Kalith paced the room like a caged storm. "Or they suspect it. Cashin's spymaster has been asking very specific questions about an Omega with a silver mark. Then they know we exist as a threat," Selwyn said grimly, "not just an inconvenience." "Good," Kalith growled. "Let them be afraid. Fear makes men careless. Fear also makes men cruel," I said, and the room went quiet, because we all knew exactly what House Vale's cruelty looked like when it decided something needed to be eliminated. My parents' execution had taught me that lesson in the worst possible classroom. The second blow came a week later, and it was aimed directly at me. I was ambushed on the road between the tower and the border camp, 3 of Vale's elite guard closing in with the kind of professional efficiency that told me this had been planned for months, not days. I fought badly, because Setsu Ren Ashgrove had never been trained for combat and I did barely half a year to make up for 18 years of softness, and I would have ended up exactly as disposable as House Vale had always intended me to be, if the mark on my wrist hadn't flared white-hot in the instant a blade came down toward my throat. I don't fully remember what happened next. Caliph told me later that he'd felt it through the bond, 3 days hard ride away, a spike of terror so absolute it had broken through his own battle meditation like glass. He said he'd never ridden that fast in his life. Rowan said his knives had found their marks before his conscious mind had even finished processing the alarm. Selwyn said the surge of magic through the convergence thread had been strong enough to nearly knock him unconscious in his tower, an ocean of distance away. When I woke, I was in Kalitha's arms, in a room in the border camp none of us had planned to reach that fast, with Rowan's hand fisted so tight in mine it left marks, and Selwyn's frantic magic still humming faintly beneath my skin where he'd poured every ounce of healing he had left into keeping me alive. Never, Calith said, voice raw in a way I'd never heard from him, do that to us again. I didn't exactly choose to get ambushed, I managed, and something that was almost a laugh broke out of Rowan, wet and relieved and furious all at once. You chose to ride the border road alone, Selwyn said, but his hand was shaking where it still rested against my ribs, monitoring a heartbeat he'd very nearly lost. You chose to keep treating your own safety as expendable, as though the rest of us wouldn't feel every single second of you almost dying. I didn't have a defense for that. I had spent so long treating myself as disposable because the book had taught me that's exactly what a discarded Omega Fiancé was supposed to be that I hadn't fully understood, until that moment, exactly how much that had stopped being true. I felt it too, I admitted quietly. Whatever this bond is, I felt all 3 of you, the second I thought I was going to die. I felt how much you'd lose if I did. Something shifted in the room, a fragile, dangerous kind of understanding settling over all 4 of us at once. We were no longer simply allies bound by matching grudges. Whatever the convergence bond was becoming, it had teeth of its own now, and it had just shown House Vale exactly how badly they'd underestimated what they'd created the day they threw one discarded Omega into the mud. House Vale had wanted to eliminate a liability. Instead, they had just made all 4 of us absolutely certain there was no version of this story where we lost. Chapter 7. The Mark Deepens. Healing took weeks, and in the strange, suspended quiet of recovery, the convergence bond finished what it had started. I won't pretend I understood the magic fully, even after Selwyn's careful, patient explanations. I understood only what I felt, a warmth that had nothing to do with fever, threading itself between the 4 of us until I could sense, faintly, when Calith was troubled 3 rooms away, when Rowan's carefully composed calm was fraying at the edges, when Selwyn had forgotten to eat again because a theory had swallowed his whole afternoon. I understood, too, the particular vulnerability of finally letting myself want something the story had never promised me. There is a version of this where I tell you the bond deepened through some single, dramatic night, and everything that had been building for months resolved itself in one clean, cinematic moment. That isn't how it happened. It happened in the ordinary, unglamorous accumulation of small things, Caliph teaching me, with startling patience, how to hold a blade properly, his enormous hands correcting my grip without a trace of the impatience I'd expected from a warrior, Rowan reading beside me in comfortable silence long past midnight, occasionally passing me exactly the right piece of gossip at exactly the right moment to make me laugh when I most needed to, Selwyn falling asleep mid-sentence over his research with his head against my shoulder, trusting me, actually trusting me enough to be unguarded in front of me for the first time since I'd met him. It happened in 3 separate, quiet confessions, over 3 separate weeks, each one costing the man who gave it more than either of us said out loud. I don't know how to want something I can't protect with force, Caliph admitted one night, silver eyes fixed on the fire rather than on me. My whole life has been about being strong enough that loss couldn't touch what mattered. You terrify me, Ren, because I don't think strength is going to be enough to keep you safe. And I want to try anyway. I've spent a decade making sure nothing could be taken from me, because I had nothing left to lose, Rowan said. Weeks later, his usual composure fractured just enough to let something real through. You made me realize I do have something to lose again. I resent you a little for that. I don't resent it enough to stop. Devotion isn't a spell I can cast, Selwyn told me last of all, ink-stained fingers laced with mine, voice unusually unsteady for a man who catalogued the world for a living. I used to think I understood the convergence bond because I understood the theory. I didn't understand anything. I didn't understand it could feel like this. I won't describe, in detail, the night the bond finished forming. Some things belong to the people who lived them, not to whoever narrates them afterward. I'll only say that when dawn broke over Selwyn's tower, the mark on my wrist had become something far more permanent than frost on glass, and something ancient and outlawed and utterly undeniable had settled over the 4 of us like a vow. House Vale's laws said an Omega could bond to one Alpha. 1. A neat, controllable, disposable arrangement. The old magic, the magic House Vale had spent a century trying to erase, said otherwise. It said a true convergence bond answered to nothing but its own truth, and its own truth was this: 3 men who had each lost everything to the same house had found, in me, and in each other, something worth rebuilding a life around. I did not yet know I was carrying the proof of it. Chapter 8: What the Bond Carries. I found out I was pregnant the same week Rowan's spies confirmed Vale's coronation had been moved up, exactly as the book had once promised, to a date now only 6 weeks away. Selwyn was the one who noticed first, of course he was, the Archmage who noticed everything, catching the shift in the convergence marks pattern during a routine check, a second thread of silver light braided now through the first, pulsing with a heartbeat that wasn't mine. That's not possible, I said, staring at my own wrist like it belonged to a stranger. It's not, I would know. Convergence bonds carry differently than ordinary ones, Selwyn said, and for once his careful scholar's composure had entirely abandoned him, replaced by something closer to wonder. The child of a true convergence bond isn't tied to a single father the way ordinary Omegaverse pregnancies are. The bond itself carries the child. Which means whoever's is it, Caliph said slowly, understanding dawning across his face, belongs to all of us. I do not have adequate words for what that moment felt like. The vertigo of discovering that the body I'd inherited, the story I'd been thrown into against my will, had just handed me something the original book had never once considered giving sets of Renash Grove. Not disposal. Not a footnote ending in an unmarked grave. A future. A family built entirely out of spite for a house that had tried to convince me I deserved neither. Rowan was the first to reach me, hands gentle where they'd once only ever been careful, pressing his forehead to mine with something raw and unguarded breaking across his usually composed features. House Vale is going to hear about this, he murmured, and they are going to understand, finally, exactly how badly they miscalculated the day they threw you away. They'll come for you, Caliph said, low and fierce, already thinking 3 steps ahead the way a war leader always did. A convergence bonded Omega carrying a child is the single most politically dangerous thing to their entire legal structure. They cannot let this become public before the coronation. They will try to eliminate the problem before it becomes a legend. Then we don't give them the chance, I said, and something in my voice must have carried the weight of every version of this story where I'd been powerless, because all 3 of them went very still, watching me the way you watch someone about to become exactly as dangerous as the world had forced them to be. We move the timeline up. We don't wait for their coronation. We expose the forged treason confession, the murdered families, the century of erased convergence bonds, all of it, publicly, before they can silence a single witness. That's 6 weeks of preparation compressed into perhaps 10 days, Selwyn said carefully. I know. It's reckless, Rowan added, though there was something like pride threading through the warning. I know that too. Caliph looked at me for a long moment, silver eyes taking in every inch of the Omega who had walked, uninvited and utterly unarmed, into a border tavern 8 months ago and asked a wolf prince for an alliance he had no earthly right to expect, and something like fierce, terrible respect settled over his expression. Then we burned their timeline down instead of ours, he said. All of it. Together. For the first time since I'd woken up in the mud outside a palace gate with a dead world's memories rattling around in my skull, the story ahead of me felt less like a book I was trapped inside, and more like one I was finally, furiously, writing myself. Chapter 9: The Coronation That Wasn't. We came to the capital 10 days later with an army of grudges finally ready to collect its debt. Calith's clans broke the northern border garrison before dawn, not to conquer, but to draw every soldier House Vale could spare away from the capital's gates. Rowan's network, patient as rot, had spent 8 months quietly compromising every financial artery keeping House Vale's loyalty bought, and on the morning of the coronation, every single bribe, every silenced witness, every threatened merchant's family went public at once, distributed through channels even the crown's spymasters hadn't known existed. Selwyn stood at my side in the coronation hall itself, a scholar's calm wrapped around magic old enough to remember when Omegas were not required to be disposable, and unraveled a century of legal fiction with nothing but truth and a very carefully reconstructed relic. And I stood in the center of it, the discarded Omega fiancé the story had never planned to give an ending, and read my parents' forged treason confession aloud to a hall full of nobles who had spent a year pretending they hadn't noticed the lie. Cassian Vale's face, when he finally understood exactly how thoroughly the story had turned against him, was the single most satisfying image I will carry for the rest of this life. This is treason, he said, voice cracking with the particular fury of a man watching an inevitability he'd never once considered possible. No, I said, and the convergence mark on my wrist blazed silver white, visible to the entire hall, undeniable proof of a magic his own family had spent a century trying to erase. This is a debt. You and your house spent generations deciding whose grief mattered and whose didn't, whose bonds were legal and whose were inconvenient, whose children got protected, and whose got thrown into the mud outside a palace gate and called disposable. I looked at Caliph, steady and enormous at my left, at Rowan, sharp and unflinching at my right, at Selwyn, magic still humming gold around us both, holding the last of House Vale's stolen convergence relics like a promise finally kept. You tried to erase every single person standing in this room today, I said. You should have made sure we couldn't find each other. I will not pretend the fall of House Vale was bloodless, or simple, or resolved in a single dramatic afternoon. No true reckoning ever is, and I would be lying to you, and to myself, if I claimed otherwise. There were weeks of tribunal, of testimony, of grief finally given the public reckoning it had been denied for a year. Cashin Vale did not keep his crown. His house did not keep its name. And somewhere in the long, exhausting unraveling of an empire's worth of lies, I stopped being the story's discarded Omega entirely, and became, instead, simply Ren bonded to 3 men who had chosen him for exactly who he was, carrying a child that belonged to all of them, standing in the wreckage of a house that had once thrown him away like he was nothing. Epilogue, a vow written in something other than ash. Spring came late that year, but it came. I gave birth in Selwyn's Tower, of all places, surrounded by 3 men who had each spent a lifetime being told love was a liability they couldn't afford, and who now stood in that small, chaotic, joy-filled room like none of them could quite believe their own luck. Caliph cried, which none of his clan would ever have believed of their fearsome war leader. Rowan, of all people, was the one who fumbled the swaddling cloth so badly Selwyn had to take over with the exasperated fondness of a man who'd apparently expected exactly that. The convergence mark on my wrist had settled, by then, into something quieter, not gone, never gone, but woven now into the ordinary rhythm of a life none of us had been promised. I think about the boy I inherited this body from sometimes. Sets a Ren Ash Grove, discarded in a single throwaway chapter, given no ending at all because the story never thought he was worth finishing. I think about the version of this tale where I simply survived quietly, the way the book expected, and disappeared into an unmarked grave by winter exactly as scheduled. I did not choose that ending. None of us did. We chose, instead, to take every grudge, every scar, every lie House Vale ever told about who deserved love and who deserved disposal, and build something out of it they never once accounted for: a bond older than their laws, a family louder than their lies, and a child who would grow up knowing exactly what it looked like when 4 people who'd been told they were unworthy of being chosen decided, instead, to choose each other. The palace gate where I first woke up in the mud, discarded and disgraced, still stands. I walk past it sometimes, now, with Calith's hand steady in mine, Rowan's shoulder brushing my own, Selwyn a careful half step behind with our child balanced easily on his hip. I am no longer the Omega they threw away. I am the ending they never saw coming. The end.